All right, thanks for joining. We're going to give everyone a couple minutes to get settled in here, and then we'll get started with our webinar for today. Thanks everyone for joining. We're just going to give it another minute and then jump right in. All right, great. Well, thanks everyone for joining. We are here with us at the Semantic Exchange today. This is our second installment of our second version of this. And this is a webinar where you get to hear from some of the experts from enterprise knowledge. So this is focused on zooming in on thought leadership pieces that have been published by our experts. And you'll have an opportunity to do question and answer with them. So if you've had any burning questions as you've read through this thought leadership piece, this is your chance to have that interactive moment with this expert. A little bit about enterprise knowledge. We're a knowledge management consultancy based in the DC area. So we get a lot of opportunity to work very deeply in this subject matter and kind of see what's happening on the ground and report back via our thought leadership. Today, you'll be hearing from Bonnie Griffin. She is one of our taxonomy consultants at Enterprise Knowledge, and she wrote a piece that is really interesting and of the moment. It's called Taxonomy in the Age of AI, Strategically Evaluating Taxonomy's Value. And she has some really interesting takes on how we should be thinking about taxonomy and leveraging taxonomy as we're working increasingly with artificial intelligence as part of our processes and workflows and consumers. So we'll give Bonnie some time to introduce this piece of thought leadership, and then towards the end, we'll open it up for question and answer. We ask that you just put your questions into the Q&A portion of the Zoom webinar here, and we'll be moderating through those. So thanks for your questions, and thanks for your engagement here. With that, I'll pass it over to Bonnie.
Thank you so much. So today we're going to talk about how to approach taxonomy as modelers and as advocates for semantics while adjusting to some seismic shifts in AI capabilities. Now today, within the broader scope of AI, we're going to focus mainly on large language models, just to scope things down a bit. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. Just to help follow along with what I'm talking about. So I think it's safe to say the general consensus is AI-powered solutions continue to have better performance, but still fall short, especially when it comes to representing organizational specificity and maintaining compliance. We also keep hearing that taxonomies and other semantic models help improve AI outputs, but apart from the general message of taxonomies help your AI solutions, there's room for more guidance and more nuance. So taxonomies still hold value, not disputing that at all, but the kinds of taxonomies, the value they provide, and how to best leverage them has shifted. So let's start with what we used to hold as true. Based on conversations with many senior modelers at Enterprise Knowledge, the most valuable kind of taxonomy used to be topic taxonomies. These would be used for query expansion, especially in complex, highly regulated domains like healthcare. For faceted search and filtering, discovery and content recommendation, and categories for large quantities of content. Now, LLMs advancements have complicated this. Now, let's just start with a very quick overview of how large language models work. So the user, at least in how we're used to it, submits a query to an AI-powered search or summarization tool. The system retrieves relevant content from the organization's dataset, passes it to an LLM, generates a natural language summary based on retrieved content and training on linguistic patterns, and surfaces that output to the user. Fair enough. But the quality of that response depends on how well the retrieved content maps to the user's intent, and of course how well written, clear, and accurate that content is. Now, we've observed, even just in the past year, a fairly dramatic improvement in LLM summary quality and accuracy, which means, in some cases, developing a topic taxonomy might not be worth it. So we're going to go on to the next slide and talk about where LLMs thrive without topic taxonomies. LLMs can perform well on these kinds of content, but hang in there because next I'll go over some cases where certain kinds of taxonomies still serve as major differentiators and are as essential as ever, if not more so. So starting with, actually, can we go back one? There we go. So foundational content, here I'm referring to content covering fundamental topics that would apply to most organizations. Think about generic human resources topics, basic customer support topics, things like that. Anything that's Organization 101. Then for structured content, we're talking about when content follows content models, is stored in tabular format, comes from code repositories, or follows any formal, consistent approach to structuring it. In this sort of approach, LLMs can follow the imposed boundaries you place on your content rather than impose arbitrary chunk boundaries that can break up the text mid-topic. Then, of course, for straightforward content, basically any content written in plain, literal, and descriptive language doesn't tend to need taxonomies for LLMs to accurately interpret and summarize it. This can apply to well-transcribed conversational content in meeting transcripts. And then finally, abundant content. Many domains, such as consumer finance, software engineering, have a lot of representation in LLM training data, so the model already has a strong baseline for concepts involved. So keeping all that in mind, let's go on to the next slide and talk about where taxonomies serve as differentiators. Now, starting off, organization-specific terminology. Taxonomies that represent key areas of an organization that would just not appear in off-the-shelf training data would be a major differentiator. Recently, we worked with a cloud-based data and AI company that had a wide array of products that could be organized into logical categories and had important categories and subcategories and attributes and ways of organizing them, but these categories and the product-specific qualities were not apparent from external documentation alone. So a product taxonomy representing the specificity and otherwise less obvious hierarchical relationships is very valuable compared to letting an LLM parse together assumptions about products based from external product pages and internal documentation. Now, another example, taxonomies for disambiguation. Now here, taxonomies and business glossaries both are helpful in the same way. Now this is where LLMs could get stuck between overlapping meanings. Now for that, I have some examples in mind. Imagine an engineer at a manufacturing firm asking about EPS requirements. Now they meant emergency power supply, but the LLM, let's say, provides an answer about earnings per share targets for the company. The engineer did not get what they want, they're frustrated, they don't trust the tool, they think it's useless, and they go back to their old way of finding information, which could be tedious and time-consuming. Or think about a bank customer asking about overdraft protection versus internal teams tracking the same issue but via regulatory language like Regulation E courtesy pay. This would be something where a taxonomy could help map between those meanings. Now, as another example, taxonomies are useful for risk mitigation and permission management. Previously, I worked on a taxonomy that had to handle customer-facing terms and internal-facing terms at a large financial technology organization. So this is where creating taxonomies of audiences and their corresponding permissions can be applied as tags to knowledge assets to make sure that they can be accessed by some audiences and not others. Now, for another example, taxonomies can be useful for assigning value. So imagine you have a team managing huge amounts of technical documentation that must be retained for document retention resources. You couldn't get rid of anything, even if you wanted to, even if some of it is duplicate or inaccurate or outdated. So here, LLMs and taxonomies can join forces. The taxonomies applied as tags can identify content that the LLM should assign greater importance to and weigh more heavily than other content, and then the LLM can surface a more valuable, curated response to the end user, rather than summarizing a massive amount of information, much of which may be outdated, duplicative, overlapping, etc. And then, just two more, taxonomies representing geographic variation. We recently worked with a client who had employee support articles representing location-specific policies at a large multinational organization that had offices in different cities, different countries, and they all had very different legal policies. So in their current state, their large language model powered summarization tool would sometimes conflate leave policies and other compliance impacted topics for different regions. So for this, imposing a regional taxonomy along with a content model helped mitigate this problem and only surface leave policies that were appropriate to a specific geographic region. And then finally, as we likely know, taxonomies are still very valuable for providing scaffolding for more advanced models, namely ontologies and knowledge graphs. This is where you could start by modeling hierarchical relationships, then model more complex non-hierarchical relationships in an ontology, which could then be instantiated in a knowledge graph. So I'm hoping this gives everyone some food for thought to think, okay, taxonomies are still very valuable, but I can be deliberate in where I focus my time and energy, where I advocate for investing that time and those resources into continuing to develop taxonomies. I hope everyone found that helpful and interesting, and I would be happy to answer a few questions.
That's great, Bonnie. Really appreciate you providing that overview. And for anyone who is unaware, these pieces of thought leadership can be found at enterpriseknowledge.com. So you can just navigate there to find more of this and other great pieces too. So audience, please feel free to drop in your questions into the Q&A portion here. And we'll go through those one at a time here. And it looks like we have one. The question is, Bonnie, how do you determine which different kinds of taxonomies were more valuable compared to topic taxonomies?
Sure. So a lot of that was just working on many different kinds of projects. So one thing that was helpful was testing competency questions that we had developed in conjunction with the client and testing these questions in the client's existing AI-powered summarization tools. We found that topic-focused questions, so the kinds of questions that we would normally think would be supported or resolved with the help of a topic taxonomy, actually performed really well without any intervention in most cases. So in those cases, we realized, okay, topic taxonomy is not the most useful. And also having conversations with other colleagues working on similar projects. Now, that was one where the geographical, the regional taxonomies did help provide really important context where the LLMs tool initially just didn't consistently give accurate or helpful answers.
That's great. And that makes me wonder a little bit also in terms of measurement. How are you measuring whether a taxonomy is actually improving LLM output in production? What does that look like? Is it more of a rigorous evaluation, or do you take more of a qualitative user feedback approach to understand that output?
So it's a mix. It's partly using, recommended strategies with golden data sets and accuracy lifts, but also qualitative user feedback. So again, as I mentioned with the competency questions, an essential starting point was defining those key competency questions that end users ask and would normally really struggle to answer quickly on a regular basis. So side by side, we would test LLM outputs before and after integrating a taxonomy to provide that semantic context and see how well they'd answer that competency question. So that's just one way within a much broader framework with a lot of different tiny details on how we evaluate those improvements and gauge whether they're significant or whether they're, not as present as we would hope.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really feeds into what our clients are asking for often, which is understanding at large, how do they get ready for AI and being able to kind of measure the effectiveness of different choices they're making with their content or semantics in order to make sure, you're leveraging the right or putting energy into the right kinds of knowledge assets to support AI outcomes. we have another question here. How do you advise on ROI? Taxonomies can be expensive and AI is rapidly improving.
So for this one, I want to start by reframing it just slightly. Taxonomies don't necessarily need to be expensive to build or maintain. I think we assume that we have to start from zero taxonomy to developing a full-fledged, very deep, very broad, very complicated enterprise taxonomy. But I would start by scoping down this taxonomy to only the most essential components, because that can be easier to build and easier to maintain. Now, what I would recommend to any client kind of mulling through this starting point is taking time to identify the areas that are the most risky for LLMs to get wrong if your organization is already moving towards or leveraging an LLM powered solution. So this could be areas of compliance, permissions, things like that, and estimate the reputational risk or legal repercussions of an LLM providing flawed or inaccurate answers to users. So odds are the cost of developing and maintaining a taxonomy to mitigate this risk would be much lower than those repercussions that could be incurred by not doing more to manage those risks or to get on top of permissions. It's a little bit of a sneaky workaround, but hopefully that still answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think that also speaks to having a clear understanding of what your use case is and why you're investing in a taxonomy to begin with. So you mentioned regulatory reporting, for example. That's an area where we're seeing that higher accuracy, and taxonomy is a critical component of that often. Here is one more question. So, can you say more on what types of taxonomy are most impactful for AI? You gave us a few examples, and I think we see some here on the screen. But yeah, what else would you mention along those lines, Bonnie?
These would be the main ones that I would want to answer here. I think it would basically be what could an LLM not answer on its own? And one that is kind of hinted at in organization specific terminology, but not quite as explicitly, is anything that's tacit information, tacit knowledge that might only live in the heads of your most senior employees. So one thing that we worked on earlier for a major vehicle manufacturing organization is they had a tremendous amount of knowledge, like who worked on this project that has familiarity with these parts, that's done these kinds of tests, that worked on this particular design. And aspects of all of those different answers would be in different places, but they were just locked up in different domains. So, of course, part of that, you need an ontology, not just a taxonomy to answer that. But I think that's one where if documentation falls short and the rest of the information you need is in people's heads, taxonomies are kind of the go-to way to extract that knowledge, model it, and make it both machine readable and human readable, and then provide that differentiation. That is what AI on its own just cannot do. It can't read our minds, but we can talk to subject matter experts and we can model the knowledge that otherwise might not be well captured elsewhere.
Right. And it's fascinating also to see how some of the improvements that we're helping clients make to their content and data using taxonomy or other semantic structures, not only help with the AI readiness aspect of it and help with improving AI outputs, but also improve the human experience of reading the content, being able to understand it based on tags that are there to view and things like that. So those two audiences always in mind of humans and machines, I think is an interesting factor here. Yeah, did you have a reaction to that, Bonnie?
No, and just another thing that I didn't get to touch on, but would probably be good fodder for a future discussion is in turn, taxonomies really help LLMs. LLMs can be really helpful for developing or accelerating the development of taxonomies, but that's probably something to get into in a future talk. So everything
Yeah,
helps
actually,
everything with a good approach.
yeah,
Anyway.
definitely. You read my mind. I wanted to go there. I wanted to ask you personally, I understand the work of the taxonomist looks quite a bit different these days as we're able to, leverage AI for different parts of our processes, the workflows for creating taxonomies. What's been your favorite part, your favorite thing to kind of collaborate with AI or offload to AI, however you want to frame that? What's been something that you found refreshing in some of the new workflows we have?
I think one thing that has been really helpful is using AI to challenge my assumptions or make me really have to work hard to justify the modeling decisions I make, because it's not like there's one exact ultimate way to represent the same domain of knowledge. It could depend on the users, it could depend on the use cases, what you're working towards, the broader context, what purpose it's meant to achieve. And so I can outline the different approaches I'm making or input these different snippets of taxonomy and then have that help me weigh the pros and cons. Or I have all of these terms, what are the different ways I could group these? And I'm still making the decision. I'm still driving the semantic modeling. I'm still doing what's interesting and challenging, but I just have a sort of foil to challenge me and to make me feel more confident in the decisions I'm making, or make me change my tactic entirely if I'm able to see, like, oh, actually, there's the issue with this. I can have it give me the pros and cons of having a particular parent concept, things like that. So I'd say that's what keeps it engaging and isn't threatening, but is instead a way to keep it challenging, keep it interesting, and ultimately have a better taxonomy to deliver at the end of it.
Awesome. That's fascinating. Thanks for sharing that, Bonnie. Well, thanks for your time today, for those of you who joined us today, and thank you also to Bonnie for your thought leadership and walking us through deeper into the thinking behind that. That's fascinating to hear. We will have a few more installments of the Semantic Exchange webinar series. Our next episode will be on Wednesday, May 20th, around the same time, I believe, 12:30 Eastern Time. And for that, I believe Bonnie will be moderating and speaking to one of our experts, Kathleen Gollner, about taxonomy versus ontology and what that means now in terms of AI as well. So please tune in for that. We appreciate the questions today. And again, thanks to you all for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.